بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. جزاك الله خير Sheikh Ziyad for the welcome. It's always good to come back to Milwaukee. So it's not my first time. It's my first time when the weather is nice. So usually I come in the winter. So I'm going to cover a number of things. One is the Zionism, the rise of the PGP in India, and Islamophobia, and the intense use of Islamophobia in the current period. First, to speak about the Israel and India's alliance, which is increasing by the day. India and Israel have military cooperation and trainings, nuclear cooperation. All indication shows that Israel assisted India in developing its nuclear program. And when they tested their nuclear device, actually at least two of the devices were to actually test the Israeli nuclear arsenal, because Israel so far have not tested. So the cooperation is there. Now I think Israel is the leading military suppliers of weapons to India. And the cooperation is very extensive. Economic relations, it's very extensive economic relations. And then cooperation in the United States, both APAC, which is the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, and the Indo-American Foundation, which is the Indian lobby, have been cooperating and strategizing together. So we see that footprint in the United States. So not only abroad, but also in here. Deployment of Islamophobia, both Hindu nationalists in India as well as in Israel and in the US, an intensive deployment of Islamophobia, demonization of Muslims, and then the use of right-wing populism in this sense. So these are images of Modi and Netanyahu being buddies in this sense, and there's a closer and closer relationship. But not to leave Israel and India alone, also we see India, the Gulf states, and Israel also are cooperating likewise. Yesterday, the United Arab Emirates gave the highest civilian prize to Modi, but not to be outdone, Bahrain also gave Modi an award, a civilian award, and basically celebrating Modi's visit. And yesterday had him speak in a stadium in Bahrain and also in United Arab Emirates. So we could see the alliances that are being struck not only in relations to India, but India, Gulf states, and Israel. And many of the Islamophobes in the US have had open-ended invitations, and now our strategic alliance with Gulf states providing advice, including Daniel Pipes. So from the indications of the relationship that are struck, now we are seeing Islamophobes from here are actually going to the Gulf states and providing advice on matters of security, as well as countering Islam and Islamic fundamentalism. So that's again how they are framing it. Just recently we published the first of its kind, or the first ever report on Islamophobia in India. It's a 157-page report after I visited Kerala in India in the south and worked with some of the Muslims in the south to counter and how to deal with Islamophobia in the south, since the PGP have been targeting and using Islamophobia and all types of strategies directed at Muslims, which are similar but in a different way what we find taking place in here. So the findings are there. I encourage for people to access. I know the projector is not providing us clarity, but the report is available online. You could download it and read it. And also there are some recommendations. Some of the key elements that we see in India today is the notion of love jihad. Now, you might not know what is this love jihad? We know jihad. What is love jihad? When a Muslim in India marries a Hindu, especially from the lower caste, the PGP party and the Hindu nationalists saying that this is love jihad, that Muslims are marrying Hindu women in order to convert India into becoming a Muslim nation. And often they attack the girl that wants to be married, and sometimes also they attack the guy, and these are photographs of individuals that have been actually killed and attacked after getting married. So this is something that we're seeing in India is taking place on a regular basis. The other is lynchings. We speak about lynching in the US, but also lynching is taking place, especially for accusation of being beef eaters. Many actually on Twitter, you will find that people will tweet that they saw such and such person eating beef or violating the sanctity of the cow, and vigilantes will come and actually end up lynching these individuals. We have many cases of beef lynchings that are occurring in India. Now, this is at a time where actually India is the largest exporter of beef to the Muslim world. So the contradiction again in here is that if you're accused of eating beef in India, you will be subject to lynching, but exporting beef to the Muslim world is something that we're seeing on a regular basis. So the PGP party is engaging in this systematic way. Now, it's connected to Kashmir, and I will get into that later, a little bit later on. But the PGP party is a Hindu nationalist party using the concept of Hindutva, which is the ideology behind Hindu nationalism. Also, they use the saffron color, which is to make yellow, to make saffron, as another aspect of the Hindutva, which is to make a Hindu nation. In the ideological construct, they say that the Muslims are a colonial presence in India. So when you speak in the Indian context, speak about colonization, they actually refer to Muslims as colonizers. And this is something that we actually did a whole workshop about what decolonization is about, because Muslims did not come to India in a military, rather through trade, marriage, and so on. But that's what the Hindu nationalists are using this framework to externalize the Muslims in there and say they don't belong. So that's again part of the strategy, and then Kashmir becomes part of this territory that we need to claim it in order to make the Hindu nation complete. So that's builds into a whole ideological construct at the foundation of Hindu nationalism. This is about the military trade with India, and specifically in focusing on the increase in militarism in India, which is another aspect of Hindu nationalism, which is to strengthen the Hindu nation by means of increasing military expenditure. India is actually one of the largest states in the acquisition of military hardware. It's one of the top countries in the world in terms of purchases of weapons. And Israel is its primary suppliers of military hardware. And it's increased, actually, its defense budget have increased over the period from 2012 till now, and that also corresponds to the intensification of their nationalism. Now we have to connect the increasing Hindu nationalism to also the intensification of Zionism and the increase of right-wing populism in general that we see in here and in Europe. So we're actually experiencing a global phenomena, not only isolated cases. And what we need is to connect the dots between them. They actually tend to share resources. They tend to actually replicate their own strategies and approaches. For example, in here domestically, you will see Trump, not that anything that Trump says can be certain, but Trump says that what we need is to increase our military expenditure in order to make the country strong again. So that's a narrative that actually is common among nationalists and ultra-nationalists and populist regime. It comes out from uncertainty about the global change, the emergence of resentment politics. Rather than addressing the problems, you actually point that somebody else is the cause of the problem rather than the failed politics. Speaking of immigration and xenophobia, in India there's a discourse about the refugees from Myanmar, as well as, again, populations that they deem to be not belonging. And in essence, even defining who's an Indian citizen has been also subject to contestation, as we see in some of the states. Before the most recent election, they actually expunged the voter rosters of individuals by saying that they're not Indians. And this is another way of actually trying to reshape the political order. So immigration, xenophobia, social fragmentation, militarism and violence, and mass media. The Indian mass media, the Israeli mass media, as well as the mass media in here, are increasingly having heavy nationalist things to it, and otherwising people that don't belong to the national project overall. And right-wing populism, which what we see in India as well as Israel, is driven by media. The role of media is driving sensationalists and scandals and coverage, and more so with social media. Again, most of the lynchings that are taking place and the attacks on beef eating in India are driven by social media. And then the main media or the mainstream media picks it up. But by that time, lynchings already have occurred. The Western media is contributing to it because it's a massive corporate entity. And many of the corporations that own media also own part of companies that are engaged in militarism, military-industrial complex as well, promoting anti-government sentiment to counter regulations and increase privatization. Politics and policy are theaters of entertainment. So these are just in terms of how the media is functioning to actually drive this nationalist sentiments that are taking place in such a way that rational discourse is no longer actually taking place in general. Another view is also to look that nationalism or populism is also taking place all over Europe, with also using Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiments. So it's not only India, it's not only United States, it's not only in relations to Zionism and Israel, but you're actually seeing this taking place across many European countries. And therefore, you could actually draw a connection between the Charlottesville March with Torches and other areas in Europe where neo-Nazi parties are using and targeting Muslims as a way to gain and win political seats in office. So again, we're seeing this phenomena. I have the ads from the 2016 elections, and I'm not going to show those ads, but these ads were Islamophobic ads that were targeted to white voters. So white voters in particular states through Facebook targeted ads, and using also ways to put these Islamophobic ads to these population to get them to come to the ballot box. The same strategy was deployed by the Indian BJP party during the most recent election, which is using Facebook, Twitter, and social media ads, as well as ads on targeting and otherizing Muslims as a way to drive voters into the ballot box. So this is again strategy that is being tested. Now, shifting a little bit to Palestine and Islamophobia. Now, this is one of the most important statements that we need to be aware of in relations to the drive toward Islamophobia. This is by Daniel Pipes. He gave this talk at the American Jewish Congress on October 21st, just immediately after 9/11. And he said, I worry very much from the Jewish point of view that the presence and increased stature and affluence and enfranchisement of American Muslims will present true dangers to American Jews. Now, interestingly enough, just today, a Republican congressman almost repeated this, but without using the American Jews. He's talking about America and how the increased number of Muslims in America will constitute a threat. Literally today, his Twitter feed exactly replicating and reflecting this. This statement begins to give the machinations for Stop the Islamization of America, as well as Stop the Islamization of Europe campaign, and the whole push toward limiting immigration, especially immigration from the Muslim world. So again, the logic in here that your presence, meaning talking about you being here, your presence, your increased stature, meaning Muslims are beginning to be in professional fields, doctors, lawyers, engaged in public policy, and so on, so that you actually have a stature within the society. Yet affluence, that you increasingly have wealth. Again, standards of living of Muslims, overall there is poverty, but overall they're above the national average in terms of income, so their affluence. And enfranchisement, meaning that you actually turn out to vote. All these four together constitute a threat. So this is his point of view in relation to what the threat of Muslims in this country, and then begin to use Islamophobia as a way to marginalize Muslims, because the Islamophobic campaign is targeted at making a gap between the individual Muslim and the broader civil society in such a way that the Muslim most likely will stay home because they're afraid that the society is not accepting them. And the general society also feel threatened by the Muslims, so they will not engage it. So it's a strategy of actually undoing or challenging this aspect relative to Muslim presence and enfranchisement in the American society. Now, Daniel Pipes also supports internment. He actually argues that the internment of the Japanese was a correct thing to do, and it was the victimization lobby that made the United States apologize and not use the internment. So he actually supports the internment and argues for the Muslims to be interned because they constitute a threat. So not only that the person is like his logic is to be tested, but also he's actually inaccurate relative to history and what is occurring. So he actually would say that internment of the Muslims at this point is needed. Now, why Islamophobia? M.J. Rosenberg, who formerly worked for the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, he said they believe that the more acceptance there is of Muslims here, meaning you at home, the less reflexive hatred there will be for Muslims abroad. And that, in their view, reduces America's sympathy to Israel. Meaning the intention for Islamophobia is to produce reflexive hatred. So when Muslims are bombed or are completely shut off in India, or you have an invasion of Iraq, or bombing a wedding in Afghanistan, that reflexive hatred reduces your sympathy, so you don't actually think that these are human beings that are being affected. So that is the intent behind the strategy of the Islamophobic campaign. And more so, Israel's role is very critical post the Iranian Revolution and the Cold War. Israel recast itself to counter and prevent Islamic extremism and Arab nationalism. So at the end of the Cold War, Israel was no longer needed because you have a singular global power, and Israel needed to recast its role, reassert its strategic value in a unipolar world, speak of a common threat with the West. So again, Israel's relationship with India says that we are trying to counter Islamic extremism because India might be supportive, or the Muslims in India might be supportive of Islamic extremism, even though that the Indian Muslims have not been accused nor had any role to play of anything relative to terrorism, but that does not stop India from making that claim in its relationship with Israel. provide training and know-how as subcontractors. Every police department in the United States sends its police officers to train on terrorism in Israel. So meaning that there is a local dimension to this, and Israel becomes the go-to subcontractor for training. It expands its foreign policy reach so as to become valuable. So India, China, and Sub-Saharan Africa is part of Israel's foreign policy objective. And that's why it's drawing closer relationship to India and closer relationship to China as well, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and become the go-to experts countering Islamic ideologies and movements. If you look at countering violent extremism design, it is actually connected to it. There's so much Israeli thinking and think tanks footprints on it, both in here and in the UK in relations to prevent. So again, that's part of the process where Israel makes itself a key ingredient in the post-Cold War period. Who's producing Islamophobia in the United States? This is very important. Islamophobia is not coming from people who are just hanging out around 7-Eleven. Okay? What you need is to understand who is the primary producer of Islamophobia. In our studies, again, this is based on tax returns, based on 990, 80,000 documents, and so on, the study. Pro-Israel activists have been the major contributor to the financing, production, distribution, and usage of Islamophobia in the American context, period. So in the United States, the financing, the producing, and the distribution of Islamophobic content is the pro-Israel groups and individuals. I estimate that 70% of the funding comes from pro-Israel sources to the Islamophobia industry. Right, so that's again based on tax returns, based on nonprofit organizations, based on the Jewish Federations of Chicago, Jewish Federation of San Francisco, LA, New York, Philadelphia, all directing resources to fund most of the Islamophobic organizations that you hear of. Not only that, the Jewish federations have been funding also Geert Wilders, who's the Dutch parliamentary person who leads a political party that is of neo-Nazi origin. And again, this is on their tax return that they funded. Also, the Jewish Federation funded the Tea Party Patriots, which again raises the question of how and why these fundings are taking place. Again, the interest is because producing Islamophobia from their perspective serves Israel's interest in the sense and solidifying U.S.-Israeli relations. So these are the pro-Israel institutions behind Islamophobia. These are groups that collectively have massive amount of resources that they spent. In the report that we have, in the report that we've done jointly with CARE, our estimate is they spent about $216 million over a 7-year period in the Islamophobia industry. So we're not talking about individuals with $2 or a can of Coke or give me a quarter. We're talking about individuals and organizations with millions of dollars of resources that are dedicated. Jihad Watch, Canvas Watch, American Freedom Defense Initiative, Washington Institute of Near Eastern Policy, Freedom Center, Center for Security Studies, Middle East Forum, Middle East Media Research, AJC, American Jewish Committee. I want to speak a little bit AJC because many Muslims now nationally have been approached by AJC to have a relationship to counter Islamophobia. In my view, AJC, and I would add the ADL and JCRC, have been the primary organizations that mainstreamed Islamophobia in policy circles. The executive director of AJC, David Harris, almost for 11 years, having a weekly radio spot, that weekly radio spot was full of Islamophobic content and demonization of Muslims. And he continues to almost unapologetically attacks Muslims. Just recently attacked Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. Before that, he attacked Keith Ellison, and so on. So that's David Harris. AJC also gave the Courage Award to Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Does anybody know Ayaan Hirsi Ali? All right. Now, why would an organization like AJC that wants to work with the Muslims on countering Islamophobia will give the Courage Award to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who actually said in CNN that she recommends for all Muslims to convert to Christianity because she herself left Islam. So again, that's AJC Courage Award to Ayaan Hirsi Ali. They recommend on their website and in their literature books of Stephen Emerson. Previously, they recommended American Jihad and so on of Stephen Emerson, one of the most Islamophobic figures. And again, Muslims think that their relationship with AJC is going to give them opportunity of open access to civil society. I say that's a contradiction in the sense that AJC is at the same time being one of the most Islamophobic organizations, and reaching out to the Muslim community to undo Islamophobia can produce much of any result. If anything, it affirms their paradigm in this sense. So this is pro-Israel institutions, again, behind Islamophobia. This is Gerd Wilder from the Netherlands. Does anybody know about the Muhammad cartoons? Right? So Gerd Wilder is the one who promoted it and wanted to have a competition of who can draw the Prophet Muhammad in a more insulting way. Then he produced another documentary called Fitna, which was an attack again on Islam. Now with him is Robert Spencer, one of the most Islamophobic figure here in the United States, and he is funded again by some of the pro-Israel organizations and individuals. Now, not only that, but the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs is also invested in targeting Muslims in here relative to the PDS. And for those who've been watching the attacks on Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, specifically is because of their positions on the PDS and their statements on the PDS. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs supposedly have spent or have allocated $25.7 million to counter the PDS in the United States. But countering the PDS is by using Islamophobia. So for example, everyone that speaks often, they target them with Islamophobic content, calling them they're sympathetic to terrorism and so on, including again on personal level. This campaign actually carried out a whole attack on my own street. Got up in the morning and my own street, all the cars on both sides of my own house street was covered with flyers calling me a terrorist, and then walk into the campus, posters all over the campus saying I'm a terrorist and sympathetic to terrorism. And the FBI discovered that there is a private Mossad that they were operating, targeting myself and a few other individuals. So again, using Islamophobia to attack individuals that are having any standing in the society. And this is the book that AJC recommended, American Jihad, which is Stephen Emerson. So anytime if any one of those people knock on your door, say, can you apologize and withdraw this publicly, not privately, because I'm not interested in, let's say, have a private discussion. Yeah, I feel, oh yeah, we did something wrong. The hurt and the attack is public, the apology has to be public. So you have to be individuals that understand that we're not into private conversation, this is a public engagement, and you have to assert the need for any type of retraction have to be in public. Another book of the professors by David Horowitz as well that targets campuses and individuals that are on college campuses. And the thing is that you go to the airports and these are on the shelves of the airport bookstores. So that means that Islamophobia is mainstream. You're not talking about looking at it in what you call a bottom shelf in the back of a grocery store where nobody reads. These are books that are often prominently displayed at bookstores in airports or bookstores in your neighborhood, and sometimes even at Costco you'll find these books actually placed in there. So we have to always complain, right? Make sure that if you see some of those, pick up the phone or say to the manager, can I talk to you? This material is Islamophobic, it's racist toward Muslim. Silence never changes things, right? You say, MashaAllah, you know, A'udhu Billah, and then move on. Yeah, say A'udhu Billah, MashaAllah, SubhanAllah, or do your du'as, but I want you to do Aqal wa Tawakkal. I want you to tie your camel or your Mercedes, complain, right? And then make dua for that. So I want you to actually make sure that these materials are, one, again, these are not scholarly material whatsoever. These just like, I wouldn't even call them yellow journalism. It's an insult to journalism to make an association with them. This is just literally a bunch of, even to say it's garbage is an insult, because you actually can recycle garbage and produce methane gas that could use it to warm society. So why not even solve that? So complain about these materials literally are racist material that I would say it's akin to KKK literature that could be dropped and introduced. The fact that it's targeting Muslims is giving the airtime and the possibility of being in there. So you have to actually be assertive about the material that are being put against you. This is creating Islamophobia imagery in public space. This is what Pamela Geller put on buses. This was buses in various cities, in New York, in Seattle, it was in San Francisco, in LA, in any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, support Israel. And then in the bottom, paid for by the American Freedom Defense Initiative, and then defeat jihad. So again, problematizing the Muslim identity as being a savage. So that's, again, mainstreaming and creating a civil society that have the Islamophobic imagery and imaginary in it. Now, when we speak about Islamophobia, there are many institutions that are responsible. It's not only the Zionists or the Hindu nationalists. In the structure, again, institutions and the machinery of the state are primarily responsible. So if you read many of the policies post 9/11, there's terrorism laws in here from 1996. All these are infused with Islamophobic content, and same across the globe. The far right incorporating the counter-jihad movement, the neoconservative movement, parts of the transnational Zionist movement, and assorted liberal groupings like Bill Maher. You know, he never misses an opportunity to be racist toward Muslims. Racism is not funny, Mr. Bill Maher. Right? He thinks that making his earning a living by constantly using Islamophobia in his HBO show on a regular basis. So there's it's not a liberal nor a progressive to be as such, but he feels at ease because the general discourse have allowed this Islamophobia. I added a sixth point to this, which is Arab and Muslim majority countries Islamophobia. So increasingly we're seeing Muslim majority countries that use Islamophobia, both the United Arab Emirates as well as Egypt, calling on Europe to monitor the mosques and to really crack down on Muslims. This is serving their own domestic interest by problematizing Muslims and Islam. And increasingly, they have a back and forth relationship with the major Islamophobic figures. So that's a sixth area of Islamophobia. Now, does anybody know Robert Mercer? Raise your hand. You know, who is he?
He's a big financier for the Republican Party.
Okay, that's all? I'm asking this question so I can drink water. I have that. Huh? Who's Robert Mercer?
He financed Trump.
Huh?
He financed Trump.
He financed Trump, but not only that. Mercer, you possibly have seen the documentary on Cambridge Analytica and the movie, right? So Robert Mercer is behind Cambridge Analytica, which basically using the internet, data mining, targeting data in order to actually arrive at a voter and to influence their vote in a particular way. Right? So Cambridge Analytica was critical in the election here, but also was critical in the election in the UK. Both these elections used Islamophobic content, right? And drove that Islamophobic content in populations that highly were susceptible to be stoked around Islamophobia. But not only that, Robert Mercer is also, and his daughter Rebecca are behind Breitbart. Do you know Breitbart? You know Stephen Bannon? Right? Okay, so link between Cambridge Analytica, Islamophobia, and also Breitbart, using it in a systematic way. So you could see that the individuals behind this campaign are dumping millions of dollars for strategic ideological purposes. So we need to understand that. The attacks on Ilhan Omar are not coincidental. Right? Why did Trump select Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Alexander Ocasio, and Presley for his attacks? Like, there's 435 congressmen and women. There's about 232 Democratic congressmen and congresswomen. Why would he focus on these four? Huh?
They're minorities, non-white.
They're minorities, non-white. Now, if you notice, Obama, the campaign against Obama used Islamophobia way back in 2008. Trump knows that he could drive white voters to the ballot box by using Islamophobia and racism. Racism actually pays and can register good, solid votes at the ballot box, especially for his base. You could drive them into coming out and voting in that way. But not only that, if you notice, Trump has a close relationship with Sheldon Adelson, who's Trump's super PAC's billionaire and backer. The movement of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was the direct result of Sheldon Adelson's demand on Trump as a way for him to pay him back for his contribution and support. Right? So again, this is Sheldon Adelson. He's one of the major Trump's backers. Him and Hatem Saban. Hatem Saban is a major Democratic Party donor. They both actually strategize together in relation to how to affect and impact U.S. policy relative to Israel and more so relative to the BDS. So again, these are top donors that are coming and using and utilizing Islamophobia in this way. Now look at these beautiful pictures. I began setting up the Center for the Study of Islamophobia after the 2008 elections. Not because of Trump. So in the 2008 election, you remember that 43% of the American public believed Obama is a Muslim, right? Today, there's still about 24% of the people still believe he's a Muslim. Right? They didn't listen to his, what's his name, Reverend Jeremiah Wright from Chicago, who was his reverend. They didn't care. And they began to represent him in Islamic garb. Now, the interesting thing, the first picture of him in Islamic garb in Kenya was actually leaked by the Clinton campaign. So Clinton herself also wanted to use Islamophobia, right? That he is a Muslim. Now, there's a reason. Anyone that is engaged in politics, you know, you do your polling data, you do your survey, you do your focus group, then you bring what you call your PR people to design messaging to specifically. The messaging of the Republicans at the time is a result of all those combined. The polling data said that 64% of the American public would not vote for a person that is an atheist, and then 63% of the American public would not vote for someone that is Muslim. So that's why they attacked him, that he is a Muslim. Right? And then also saying he's a socialist is another way of saying he's an atheist, he doesn't believe in God, and so on. So these were the two lines of attacks on Obama. It did not succeed in 2008 because the people were in an anti-war footing. They were tired of Bush, Cheney, and his company being in war, the failures in Iraq, and so on. So they wanted to change. But 2010, it succeeded. Right? You remember 2010, the Ground Zero mosque, which was not a mosque, nor was it on Ground Zero, but who cares? The Republican picked it up in July as a campaign theme, and then after the election, you did not hear again of Ground Zero. Right? So again, using Islamophobia, fear as the strategy. And I argue that people in this country, especially among whites, and here whites not relative to skin tone, but whites who have a nationalist and supremacist point of view, wanted to use the N-word on Obama, but they found it easy to use the M-word on him. And then come back and you become more comfortable of using the N-word in public discourse. Right? So again, it was a convenient way of using racial markers in the same way that every time you say you want to be tough on crime is a coded word for being tough on communities of color. So we need to know coded word language that are used in political discourses. Now, this documentary, Obsession, till today is the most expensive single use of Islamophobic material in US history. The documentary Obsession was distributed, 28 million DVDs were distributed during the 2008 elections at a cost of $17 million. I don't know, how many of you here have $17 million? If you do, I'll talk to you outside. But somebody would not drop $17 million unless they have many folds and expect returns for it. Again, because politics is about investment. And then immediately after Obama's election, they produced the third jihad. Right? The third jihad, and you could see Obama's eyes in there. They actually opened the second documentary, Third Jihad, with my speech at the UN Plaza in San Francisco. Right? I need to ask them for copyrights to it. But anyway, so this is the third jihad. The third jihad is that the Muslims are being dressed in suits and ties like me. Hope you like my tie. Right? And now we're in third jihad, while the other one was the radical militant jihad. So immediately after this, there was a hearing in Congress, or attempt to get a hearing in Congress about the Muslim interns that work in congressional offices. So again, you could see seeding public discourse in media that produces immediately after that political action in relations to targeting Muslims. So there is a relationship between Islamophobia and public discourse and what is taking place in here. This was developed by the Endowment for the Middle East Truth. That term itself is problematic. It's the Clarion Fund, which share an office in New York with Ahish HaTorah, which is an Israeli group. So literally, Obsession was an Israeli-funded and cooperated documentary that was placed in the United States to influence election. So again, this was the Israeli campaign to impact US election. We have many people speak about the Russian intervention in US election, but nobody will mention about Israeli intervention in US elections. Right? So again, this is something that we have. I'm going to jump off this. There's ideological force behind this campaign, and the ideological force is the Clash of Civilization work of Huntington, and then his second book, Who Are We? Clash of Civilization says that the threat to Western civilization comes from the Muslims and the Chinese, and using cultural racism. Again, cultural racism become used as a signpost for biological racism. And then Huntington, Who Are We? Says that the Mexicans or the Latino immigrants are the biggest threat to America because they don't integrate and so on, and defining America to be, America is a white, Christian, Anglo-Saxon society. White Anglo-Saxon settler society. So in essence, you have to accept that framing in order for you to, in essence, to become American in relations to who we are. And that begins the rationalization for limiting immigration and reshaping the political discourse. Many of these individuals that right now are around Trump are also part of the neoconservative actually have taken into the Clash of Civilization thesis. Even though that Edward Said says it's a clash of ignorance. But again, if the book sells and people are read it, then it must be true, right? So again, this is where marketing and media presence and having it being utilized as a primary material have its impact. Now, in his thesis, he says, it's my hypothesis that the fundamental source of conflict in the New World will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divide of humankind will be around cultural. And in essence, for us who study this, cultural racism is a signpost for biological racism. After 1945, you could not say that there are people that are more superior because of biological makeup. So you begin to use cultural. Well, their dress, they don't dress like us. Their dress is not susceptible to modernity. Their food is smelly. They don't have good hygiene. So we need to, get them into civilization. Maybe if they could shop more, they would be better. So you begin to use cultural nuances that are in the way of biological racism. So that's, again, the arguments in there. Now, what drove the right-wing populism? Actually, again, two Jewish marketing individuals in political campaigns have actually designed the strategy for driving right-wing populism. And this is an article that is really very important to read. And the unbelievable story of the plot against George Soros. So they used George Soros and targeted George Soros as a way to drive right-wing populism, including Trump. If you remember the last ad in his campaign, he put George Soros' image with other financiers and then also Star of David as a way to say there's a conspiracy in there as a way to drive right-wing populism in this sense. He says starting in the 2008, Birnbaum and Finkelstein worked in secret to get Orban, who was in Hungary, elected. Their victory in Hungary made way, let me see, I can't even see from the, their victory in Hungary, away from the intense political scrutiny of Western Europe, showed that constructing an external enemy could bring electoral success in the modern era. It allowed Hungary to give birth to Trump before Trump, as Steve Bannon said. So again, this was a sophisticated campaign that they have run. And he said Finkelstein's premise was every election is decided before it even begins. Most people know who they will vote for, what they support, and what they oppose. It's very difficult to convince them otherwise. Finkelstein believes it's a lot easier to demoralize people than to motivate them. And the best way to win is to demoralize your opponent's supporters. That's what Trump did, so to great effect against Hillary Clinton. And what he meant when, after the election, he thanked black Americans for not voting. So again, the strategy for driving right-wing populism is to suppress your opponent's turnout. And then the Republicans also deployed other strategies, which is making it difficult for people to register to vote, expunging rosters of voters from the electorate. So you go to vote, your name is not there, so you're not able to get to vote. Racism by designs when election. Finkelstein had long been studying the big political trends and settled on simple issues that could do the most damage. In the end, he noticed it usually comes down to the same concerns: drugs, crime, and race. So again, you actually use those three to drive the electorate into right-wing populism in the campaign. Now, I want to shift a little bit when we think about U.S. history. So this picture actually of the KKK rally down Pennsylvania Avenue. And so this is at a time in the early part of the 20th century where the KKK was actually a major organization in the U.S. And having been welcomed to the White House. The film Birth of a Nation was actually shown in the White House. So this is again, comes from a long history of right-wing populism that also have white supremacy at the foundation of it, using violence and terrorizing African Americans. So the long history. And then the long history of lynching in this country, we often actually don't think of it. lynching intensified after the Civil War. The high point of lynching in the United States is from 1876 to 1950, where approximately 4,000 lynchings occurred in 12 southern states. On average, 2 African Americans were being lynched per week. Lynching was organized terrorism against African Americans to contest their political power, to contest their right access to economic resources, access to land, and political office. So again, this was something that was systematic. Now today, in America, every week 2 African Americans get shot by police. So you could actually make the data between the shooting and between the lynching period and the policing and the intensification of the prison industrial complex. 1 in 4 African Americans end up in prison. 31 states, actually African Americans lose their right to vote once convicted. So 31 states actually have a structural disenfranchisement of African Americans that leads to structural disempowerment. Not only that, we have also massacres against Chinese Americans. The Chinese Exclusionary Act from 1882, and it really did not get to be undone until 1965. In Los Angeles, we often think of California as a liberal place, but actually the Chinese Exclusionary Act was first adopted in California and then went nationally, and LA actually covered up the massacre of 17 Chinese. You have also a massacre in Wyoming, Rock Spring, Wyoming, where whites turned on the houses and the encampment of Chinese, and also had a massacre. 24 Chinese were massacred during this period. So we often don't think of these elements, and now violence have come back again, specifically by white supremacists and white nationalists. The FBI study says that the primary domestic threat in the United States is white supremacist and white nationalist violence. Yet all of the resources are targeting Muslims and having Muslims as the primary security threat, and you have mosques and institutions being monitored. So again, even the data of the FBI not being followed. So right-wing populism is active in Europe, and we have all kinds of political parties. And I think these are 2. Now I want to cover how to respond to Islamophobia. You need to make the information known and educate people. Expose and challenge Islamophobes. You have to be on top of exposing the Islamophobes and making sure that you actually make them unwelcome in civil society. You need to develop coalitions that challenge racism across the board. Become more active in all areas of civil society. I want you to write a blog, develop sources of information on the internet and other sources, donate, and support institutions. Now for everyone in here, do you have a phone? We're not going to play again, but do you have an iPhone or Android? I want you to get your phone out, and you need to download the Islamophobia reporting app. All right? So again, experience Islamophobia report. You could report in Arabic or in English. Later on, we're going to add other languages. Now the reason is we don't have data, right? We don't have data. I am all for feelings, but you could tell feelings your therapist. Policy does not work without data. So we need data, and you need to report incidents of Islamophobia. Only a small number of incidents get reported to the FBI. So the FBI says we only had 367 cases of Islamophobia in the US in 1 year. I know in Berkeley, in my class, if I ask my student how many of you experienced Islamophobia incidents, of the following, how many of you have been saying, go back home, you camel, so-and-so, what is this rag on your head, right? You Muslim bomber, so on, I would bet I will get over 300 cases just by asking my classroom. But the reason is that we are not reporting. We're not actually informing and putting the data out. Those incidents that require follow-up legally will turn some of those cases to the MLFA. I'm on the MLFA board. I also will turn those cases to CARE, Asian Law Caucus, National Lawyers Guild, or ACLU. So if you have a case that requires, for example, if you have an employment, Islamophobia employment related, right? You have a legal case that requires an employment to follow up on that. So we could follow up on it. So you need to download it, especially for women. In the United States, 76% of the violent attacks, Islamophobic attacks, target women. 76% of violent attacks target women. In France with CCIF, 80% of violent attacks, Islamophobic attacks, target women. So reporting becomes also a means of protection and making sure that you actually report this. So we have data drives policy. I need you to actually deliver the data and make sure to report. Have tawakkul on Allah, but I want the data from you. Lastly, I'm asking for your support. Said the last point for donation. So if you want to donate and support the Islamophobia Research Center, by all means, we have a pledge cards out there that you are able to fill. I'm not going to sit and ask you for how much you. So please, if you are able to donate, if you could do a monthly donation, $25 a month or something like that, by all means. We publish the only journal on Islamophobia in the world. It's an academic journal, and we publish monthly country reports, 36 European countries, as well as we just finished the India report. So any support that you will offer will go directly to support the center. So Jazakumullah khair. I know that we're going to pray, but if you have any questions, I'll answer them later on. Jazakumullah khair.